This is our international meeting in the year when people who want to talk about host leadership, learn about it, explore it, use it, teach it, write about it, we all come together and we share our ideas and we try and take the approach forward. We learn it, but we also want to find ways to take it forward gently. So my name is McKergow, and as Leah said, host leadership is kind of mostly my fault, I'm afraid. Sorry for that. I live in Scotland, in Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, a great city, and of course still part of the United Kingdom at the moment. I'm working to make a new arrangement about that. And Scotland and Bulgaria have some things in common. I don't know if you've worked this out. There's a few key factors I want to point to that link Scotland and Bulgaria. So first of all is drink. In Bulgaria you have rakia, and in Scotland of course we have whiskey, Scotch whiskey. We have bagpipes in common. The Bulgarian bagpipe, which looks like a dead sheep with pipes coming out of it, is a famous instrument. In Scotland we have the Highland bagpipes and everyone wears the kilt and everything, and this is not music for indoors, right? This is music to be heard from miles away, okay, because it's very loud and out of tune. And the other thing that links us is tennis, or at least it used to, because you have your Grigor Dimitrov quarterfinals of the French Open this week, and we have Andy Murray, who a few years ago was also in that league, but I'm afraid is not quite as good as he used to be at the moment, knocked out in the first round of the French Open, and that might be his last time there. But anyway, we both have strong tennis players, so that's another nice thing that connects Bulgaria and Scotland. So what I want to talk about today is I want to run you through a little bit of the birth story, the origin story of host leadership. Because it's nice to hear it from the person who experienced it, I think, for everyone. And then I want to take stock. It's 10 years since the first book was published, and it's a good moment, I think, to say, I want to tell you what I think I've learned since the book came out, about the 6 roles of host leadership in particular. So I'm going to share that, and then we're going to have a little conversations about what do you think is missing from the roles, what might you want to add, and what might come next. Okay, so the session is timetable to be for an hour, but I'm not going to speak for an hour. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes or something like that. And then we'll all have the chance to think about what I've said and put our own stuff forward as well. Okay, is that clear? And if you have a question, just like wave your arms around and shout it out. It's not a big group today, so please, if you have a question, just chuck it in. If you have a thought, that's good, hold that thought. You'll have a chance to talk about it later. But if you have a question, please just shout it out, wave your arms around, jump up and down, play the bagpipes or whatever you want to do. Okay, so this is where, sorry about that, this is where the host leadership story starts. It's Monday the 13th of February 2003 at 11:30 in the morning. And I am in a workshop at the second Sol World Conference, which is the Solution Focused People's Conference, which I also started. And we're in a workshop with Matthias Varga. I don't know whether any of you know Matthias Varga and Inza Sparrow. They are experts in systemic structural constellations, which is a way of doing therapy with families and groups. Hello, good morning. Come and have a seat, please. Thank you. And at about 11:30 in the morning, Matthias was talking about the way you host a structural constellation, which is lots of people moving around, basically. And he said this. He said, there's an old Arabic proverb. He said, the host is both the first and the last. The host is both the first and the last. And I thought, well, that's the leader, isn't it? The leader is both the first and the last. And this image came to my mind, a well-known image of the ship's captain. You know, when the ship sinks, you know that the captain should be the last person off, because they're responsible for everybody else, and they should be making sure everyone else is safe before they make themselves safe. So that's the last. But also the captain should be first, because somebody has to make sure that everything is organised on the ship and ready for everyone else. And the same happens on aeroplanes, even today. On every flight, you see the captain is on the first, and he leaves, or she leaves, the last. So I thought, this is the leader, isn't it? And I stopped listening to Matthias Wagner about systemic structural constellations, and I scribbled in my notebook a triangle. This triangle. So we have the hero, the servant, and the host. And the hero is a very well-known leadership metaphor, and has been with us since time, the beginning of time. The idea that the hero comes to save the day and show the way, and we just follow the hero and everything will be all right. This is a well-known idea. Later, in the 1970s, there was this idea of the leader as a servant, the work of Robert Greenleaf. And this was a deliberate counterblast to the hero idea. How about the leader wasn't a hero, but they serve their community? The leader serves their community, they support their community, they don't tell the community what to do, they respond to what the community wants. And it's a brilliant idea, but it's not had much impact, I'm afraid. Because people don't understand what servants are, and it's all sorts of things. The problems about servant leadership, I mean, it hasn't had a big take-up. But I thought, well, just a minute, if the leader is the first and the last, then the hero is the first, the hero leads the way, yes? And the servant is maybe the last, puts themselves last, serves other people first. And the host, therefore, if the host is both the first and the last, then the host is above that spectrum and points to different places. There are different places you can be along that spectrum, from absolute hero to total servant. And the host leader could occupy any of those places. So we have this interesting balance of the first and the last going forward, serving other people, and so on. So I drew this diagram, literally that diagram, in my book, my notebook. And I started thinking about this idea and began to try and develop it and explain it, and people liked it. But they said, we need more detail than that. So then, 6 years later, the first paper was published in 2009, Host Leadership Towards a New Yet Ancient Metaphor, and was published in the the International Journal for Leadership in Public Service, thanks to my great friend Steve Onyet, who was editing the journal. Hello. Fine, thank you very much. And he was a great supporter of host leadership. He's no longer with us. I'm sorry about that. And so this paper, I developed the ideas, and in the paper I presented a new version of the triangle with these four opposites. So you define the event and you respond to what happens. So yes, you plan and you have expectations, but you also have to respond to what happens on the day. You engage and provide your guests, provide for your guests, and you join in with the event along with everyone else. So you can't lead a thing as a host and not be part of it. If you invite people for a meal, you have to eat the meal with them. Otherwise it's a restaurant, and that's very different. You protect the boundaries and you encourage new connections. And look to invite people in, maybe the right sort of people. And finally, to sum it up, you be the first and you be the last. And so that paper contains this version of host leadership. Step forward, has more detail. Well, people again said you need more detail. So Helen and I, that's Helen up the top right there. Helen and I embarked on a process of several years, it was a decade for me and about 4 years for her, of going around talking to people we thought were either great leaders who acted like hosts, or great hosts who acted like leaders. And some of these people you may recognise, and some you almost certainly won't. I won't go through them all, but I went out to meet the Bedouin Arabs in the desert who have a great hospitality culture. We talked to Chris Bonington, the Everest mountaineer. That's Ivan Meisner from Business Networks International, great friend and still a great supporter of host leadership. And there's Maria Gicheva, who Leah will remember, was living in London, but an amazing host, really, really switched on lady, who did very interesting work with organisations in London. Chris Anderson of TED, I think he's a fantastic host leader. Indeed, I wrote about him a couple of weeks ago. No, last week. Last week's piece was about Chris Anderson's latest book, Infectious Generosity. And finally, Ronnie Scott, a British jazz saxophonist, who was a very good saxophonist, but is much better remembered for starting his club, Ronnie Scott's Club in London, which gave a space for British jazz musicians and still does so, along with international stars, even today, more than 60 years later. So we pulled all this stuff together, and Helen and I had this huge amount of ideas, and we had to put it into a framework. And so we did in the host book, and then later on, 2019, after the host leadership gathering, then I pulled together with Pierluigi Pugliese a field book, a collection of 30 chapters of different experiences. And both these books have the framework of roles, not rules. So why did we choose this idea of roles of a host leader? Well, we thought briefly about having rules of a host leader, but rules are things you have to do all the time. And here's a sign I found on Santa Cruz beach. The rules of the beach: no alcohols, no fires, no bikes, no skateboards, no dogs, no feeding the wildlife, and probably no fun either. And so we didn't want roles, because the point of host leading is it's very contextual. What you do depends on what's happening. So you can't have rules. Instead you have roles. Roles, ways to step forward when needed in different capacities. And a host leader takes on a role, does something, and then maybe thinks about the next role that they want to step forward in. And we decided this was the way to present it. And so we had this. Now the idea of first and last has become stepping forward and stepping back. And that's an idea. Sometimes you need to step forward and act slightly heroically on the heroic end of the spectrum. Other times you need to step back and act more like a servant, remembering that original spectrum that we had. And so these are the 6 roles and the 4 positions that Helen and I put in our book, and that's kind of still roughly where we are. So the initiator role, and Leah has put posters of these roles, by the way, lovely posters that she designed herself around the room for today. The initiator role, which is about deciding on priorities and getting things moving, getting things started with first steps often. The inviter role, reaching out to engage people and invite them to be involved rather than telling them. Space creator role, creating a lovely space for things to happen, just as we have here today, a space that will support the interactions you want. The gatekeeper role, which is about the boundaries, negotiating the boundaries. What happens when you come into the space, into the boundary, across the boundary? What happens then? What are the house rules inside the boundary? Who needs maybe to be sometimes excluded? And a complex role, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute. The connector role, about introducing everyone, making sure people know each other. And when I ask people, as I do in host leadership workshops, what does a good host do? Often one of the very early answers is they introduce people to each other. It's absolutely right. And finally, the co-participator, who joins in along with everyone else, as well as leads. So eats the same food, even though they've been organising the providing of it. And then we have these 4 positions on the other side, which I play different places where hosts stand to get a different view of what's happening. There's in the spotlight, which is what I'm doing now, talking to you, and sometimes leaders need to do that, and it's good to be skillful at it when you do. With the guests, chance to meet people one-on-one, small groups, chance to connect. And not all leaders are very comfortable with that. I had a boss way back when I used to work in the nuclear power industry, and I had a boss who hated doing that. And it was only then that I realised how important it was, because he was missing out on so much of what people were thinking, because he never asked them. He never put himself in a place to be spoken to. He used to avoid it at all costs. And there's in the gallery, stepping back and taking the overview and thinking, what's happening, how's it going, what do I need to do next, is there anyone being left out, what needs to be refreshed, or is it time to move on yet? And so standing back is a good place to be. Roughly where our photographer is standing now is a good place to do that, kind of behind everyone, and you see what's going on. And finally, in the kitchen in our model is a private place, a behind-the-scenes place where the leader can go to think, to reflect, to talk to their close colleagues, to maybe get coaching or development, whatever. But the other three all happen with the people, and this one happens slightly more in private. So the book host has this structure, basically. Explores the metaphor to start with, and then it looks at each of these things in turn. Quite a lot of stuff. So what am I trying to say today is what have I learned over the last 10 years about Israel? And it's the first time I've ever given this talk. So this is kind of new stuff in a way. I'm saying this for the first time. And I hope it comes out right. Okay, how are we doing for time? Not too bad. So I'm going to go through the 6 roles and say what have I learned about each. And then we'll have a conversation about what do you think and what else is missing and so forth. I have thoughts about that too, but I want you to talk about it, and then I'll share my thoughts at the end of the session. So here is the initiator role. And our summary 3 points of the initiator role in the book: hearing what's being called for. What does the organisation need next? And that's something there, that is not a kind of heroic role. That's much more of a stepping back role, and having a think and listening to people about what do we need now? Then finding the long-term goals, hopes, intentions, aspirations, and then getting things moving in small steps. That's the initiator. It's one thing to have a long-term goal for something. It's another thing altogether to start making progress. And the old saying about every journey starts with the first step is absolutely right. So the good initiator combines long-term thinking with close-up, small steps. Let's start to move towards that. And I think it's still a great place to start. I'm very happy with the initiator rule. And particularly the framework of the User's Guide to the Future, which is about how you move from long-term hopes to small next steps, that's in the book has been a real hit. And that's something that you can just use that on its own. In fact, some people would have written a book about that and done very successfully at it, I think. But it's just a small part of a chapter in the host book. Priorities are still really important for a leader, I think. And that's, I'm going to make a few references. You may know in the UK we're just about embarking on a general election campaign right now. So potential change of government and so on. And there's some good lessons from host leadership for the people involved in that. Firstly, your priorities is really important still. And I think that's a very strong place to start. If you take over an organisation, or you're building an organisation, or you have a team, you want to say, well, what are the priorities? To help people be clear on what's important, what matters. So still keep doing that. And those priorities, of course, don't just have to be a list of priorities. They could fall under different headings. So I myself, every Monday, I set myself goals on a 2-monthly basis, so for 2 months. And then every Monday I look, and these are in 7 headings, 7 priority areas, and I think, what progress can I make this week in each of these 7 priority areas? And so it's not just a simple list, and there's an example of priorities in different areas. I think that's a very strong way to work as well. One thing that we didn't put in the book, and I think should be, is the idea of closing the loop. The idea of the initiator role is not just about beginning things, it's also about ending things. It's about saying this isn't a priority anymore, because we have this other priority that is now more important. And if you just set priorities and not stop the old ones, then after a while it starts, like the priorities, there's 20 priorities. And you can't really work with 20 priorities, I don't think. It doesn't make sense. So I think as leaders we want to think about not just setting new priorities, but re-evaluating, closing, saying how we're going to, that piece of work needs to carry on, but it's not really a priority because we can do it now, so that's all right. So let's do that, but then now we need to start a new thing. So that's something I would add more of, is this idea of being clear that what the priorities are now and helping people engage. And I think, the old adage of 7 plus or minus 2 is a good starting point for how many priorities you have. I'd say probably no more than 7, and 5 would be a good start, because most people can remember 5 things at once. So the inviter role, using the soft power of invitation, and you've all responded to Leia's invitation to come here, so thank you for that. Reaching out to people with a welcoming hand. And the soft power invitation is contrasted with the hard power of force and coercion. And this is still a topic that people are becoming more aware of. It was invented by Professor Joseph Nye, who was then at Harvard University, in terms of international diplomacy. And and he says, if I can make you want to do what I want you to do, then I don't have to force you to do what you don't want to do. If I could just sort of take a sidestep for a moment, I think that the silly Brexit thing was an exercise in people imagining they had hard power and abandoning their soft power to use their hard power, and then discover that they didn't have any hard power. And when you're a country of 60 million arguing with a union of 500 million, you have less power than you might suppose, unless you're a British exceptionalist. Because we're British, of course they'll do what we say. No, they won't, not anymore. So, soft power is underexplored, and I think this is the key thing with the inviter role. And then finally, offering choice and space rather than forcing coercion. So the idea is that you invite people and you let them make their own minds up. And in one of the best bits of the book, we come to the conclusion that if, as my community building colleague Cormac Russell puts it, if your no is impossible, then your yes is meaningless. So in other words, a real invitation, and no has to be okay. Right? There are ways of issuing disguised instructions and making them look like invitations, but the way to see a disguised instruction is to say, is no possible? Because if no is not possible, then yes doesn't mean anything, because people have no choice. So I want people to have choice, and I want to make those choices. Because when people make their choices, they make their own choices, to join in with you, then you already have a commitment from them, which is really valuable. And it says, offer choice and space most of the time. And I'm going to come on to this in what I've learned. So there's lots more to be said about this, about acting invitation. Something, again, you could write a whole book on it. The power of a yes is very strong. When you say to people, would you like to? Please, I would like you to do this, be involved in this, would you do it please? And they say yes. That's incredibly valuable. It's much more valuable than saying, now for next year, your priorities are going to be this and that. And they go, oh, okay then. Right? That's not a real good yes. And so I want people to be, when you invite someone and they accept, I want a good, strong yes from them. It's a great start, it's a great commitment, it's very valuable. And there's an expression in English, which you may or may not know, to twist someone's arm. And what that means is not literally to twist their arm, but it means to kind of persuade them. I call it leaning on them a little bit. and the choice can be offered, and you can, you're allowed to use a little bit of arm twisting and leaning to do that. About, look, if you do this, then perhaps next time you can do that other thing that you'd like to do probably more. So it's okay, I think, in thinking invitationally, to use a little bit of arm twisting and leaning on people. Because in the end of the day, we have to, there are things to be done in an organisation, and we need people to do them. So it's not like we're offering an open choice about everything. There can be a degree of persuasion, and that's fine. And here is another general elections thing. One of the powers, almost the only power the British Prime Minister has, is to choose their cabinet members. Like, the inner circle of government. So there's a Minister for Defence and a Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Money and so on. And those people, they are invited by the Prime Minister to do that. And they can say no. And some of them do. And they say, I don't want to do that job. Minister for Northern Ireland is a horrible job. I don't want to do that. But I'll do Minister for the countryside. And then there's a bit of arm twisting goes on. Because we need a Minister for Northern Ireland, even though it's not the easiest job at all. But it is, so even at these top levels of government, the Prime Minister cannot tell people to be the Minister for Northern Ireland. They have to say yes. It's very interesting. Even at the very top of the British government, this process of invitation is happening, and it's underappreciated. People imagine the Prime Minister just goes around and says you, and you. But they don't. There are often tough conversations about under what circumstances would somebody be prepared to be the Minister for Northern Ireland, for example. So we look out for these points of invitation. They're actually, I think, more out there than you think. And even when you would contrast invitational thinking with the army, for example, where we all know that army people get trained to follow orders. Yes? And in the heat of battle, you follow the order and that's it. And we think, and I never joined the army because I didn't like that idea. But, have they made a choice? Yes. Because they decided to join the army in the first place, and they knew what they were signing up for, and the excitement and all of that stuff is worth the kind of following the system. And actually also, thing I learned in writing the book, army officers are greatly trained in soft power, and indeed serving and leading. And the British Army leadership manual is called To Serve to Lead. And it's all about you look after your men first, or your troops first, not yourself. You put yourself last all the time, as an officer in the field. And of course that's what makes it work. So at the crucial moment when the officer says, right, forward, everyone does it, because you've built the relationship over a period of time. Very, very interesting, and there's stuff in the book about that. So lots more to be said about invitation, the issue. The space creator role. Creating a space that supports the thing you want to have happen. And this is hardly in any leadership books. Leadership books don't talk about how do you set up your boardroom, or how do you set up your office, or how do you create the space where the things you want to happen can happen. We put in the book, Helen and I, 3 sorts of space. The physical space, the interactional or psychological space, which is not how does it feel in the space, and finally the headspace for yourself. Helen teaches meditation. She's very keen on this idea. And she's right, that leaders need some headspace as well. And many leaders are overburdened with other people's problems and don't have enough time to reflect on their own, possibly in the kitchen position. So, under-recognised, underused in the vast majority of organisations, as I see. You can get a lot more just by rearranging stuff and thinking carefully about how does it feel, how are we holding people's anxiety. So that not very visible thing says change of pace plus change of place equals change of perspective. That's right. And it's why so often when we want to run workshops with organisations, I'm often asking them to let's do it somewhere else. Because it does make a difference. Just simply being in a new place makes a difference. And the more we acknowledge that and utilise that, then better. And when you think about spaces where people happen, people often think, oh, let's do it in a theatre. That's a theatre up there, a very posh theatre. But the thing with theatres is that they are designed for lots and lots of people looking at one person. So theatres are heroic spaces, really. It's not about engagement between the audience, it's all the audience engaging with the few people lucky enough to be on the stage. And if you're putting on a play, then a theatre is a great space. Very well developed space. But if you're not putting on a play, which most of us aren't at work, it's a rubbish space. It's awful. So don't think about theatres. Think about other kinds of space where we can get lots of interaction between people. And here's another space example from our British general election campaign. Did this make your news where you are? This is Prime Minister Rishi Sunak declaring the election in the rain outside his office in Downing Street with no umbrella. Right? And his suit is absolutely soaked. You can see that on the picture. And he looked just miserable and wretched. And he didn't look prime ministerial at all because he hadn't thought to take an umbrella out with him and protect himself from rain. His aides didn't think about that. So it's a very badly chosen space outside your office when it's tipping down with rain and you've got an umbrella. It's not a good space choice. Gatekeeper role. Now, this is, notice the figure in the icon. One of the gates is closed and one of them's open, and this is a kind of about the boundary, the threshold, and what happens inside the space. Where is the boundary? Who and what is allowed in? Who and what is not allowed in? What happens when they enter? What are the rules inside the space? What is the gatekeeper both welcomes people and occasionally checks them out if they shouldn't be there. The role of the gatekeeper is to welcome people over the threshold, set useful boundaries and house rules, and occasionally be prepared to say no. Now that's not something for this space, but do it in a positive way, which means that's not something for this space, but there is another space for that. Why don't you go and do that there? So I think this is the most complex and important role. And again, you could write a whole book about this. There are a few thoughts that have come to me in recent times. It is all about boundaries. And a boundary is not necessarily a barrier, but it's something changes when you go over a boundary, when you cross a boundary. The negotiating of the boundaries, and ideally it's negotiated, not imposed, but there are times when leaders need to impose boundaries. And I have, in recent years, developed this very simple model of the container, which, in terms of organisational consultants and even managers and leaders, is very useful. And a container is what's inside the boundary, and the container is defined by the topic, the people, the place, and the time. This is in my book, Hosting Generative Change, which is an organisational development book, a couple of copies over there. And I introduced it there, inspired by various other people, including Chris Corrigan, Ed Olson, Glenda Yo Yang, but trying to make it simpler. And this has attracted some attention recently. You can say, oh, actually, that's quite good. Because you can imagine a topic, some people, a place, and a time as being a container. And then there's the question of, is it persistent or is it rebuilt? And so sometimes containers can run for ages. So I am the chair of Sunday Assembly Edinburgh. And the Sunday Assembly movement is a network of secular congregations. And And so we do things that look like church, but with no religion involved at all. And Sunday Assembly at Edinburgh is a good container. And I think it persists. We meet every month. And it's, the topic is kind of the same, although there are different speakers. The people change, although there's a committee that is more stable. The place is generally the same meeting place every time. The time is the same the first Sunday of the month at 11:30. And I would say that Sunday Assembly Edinburgh is a container that persists. Even though things change about it, it's kind of fundamentally the same container, although it evolves. Whereas other things, like this meeting here, Host Leadership Gathering, I think this is a one container for our meeting here, and then we will go our separate ways, and there won't be another one. There may be similar ones, but they'll be different. Because they'll be in a different city, and with different people, and a different organiser, and a different agenda. Okay, maybe that's high level, the topic's the same, but that's not enough. So I'd say that it's something interesting to think about this. Does the container persist, or is it rebuilt every time? And as a leader, I think that's really important. I want to know about that. I want to think about it in those terms. Then there's the importance of welcoming people at the threshold. And I think this is more and more important now. I have learned that this is more and more important. And the threshold is like the edge of the boundary into which you enter the space. And so here it's quite nicely organised, because we come up in the lift to the second floor, and there is, at the bottom of the thing you meet at the lift is the welcome desk, where you get welcomed, and then the rest of the thing happens like past the welcome desk. Very, very nicely organised. And the importance for the leader to meet people as they enter the space is really important, because it's the chance you have to establish what the space is, where the boundary is, and also to tell people about whatever house rules there are. And this is another idea that I think is even more important now. In a container, you can have a house rule, or house rules, ways we act, ways we work together, things we do, things we don't, that apply in your container, even if they don't apply more widely in the organisation in general. So if I'm running a project group in an organisation, often we'll have some house rules. We'll agree them at the start about how we want to work together. And then we'll really try and work with that. But they only apply when we're in the project group. Now, you might aspire to them elsewhere, but we stick with them within that container. And so the moment people step over the boundary into the space, we have to make clear to them what our expectations are, what people have agreed, and how we're going to work and how we're going to be in this space. And then there is the occasional need to exclude someone. And there's the picture there of somebody being excluded by the other people in the circle. And this doesn't happen all that often, thankfully, because it's usually not terribly pleasant, but it is something that a host leader should be prepared to do. Just as a party host has to be prepared to ask people to leave if they're disrupting you, a host leader should be, in the end, has to be prepared to ask people to leave the container or even the organisation if it's not working out. And there are good and less good ways to do that. And I write in the book about how to do a positive no, which is one of the good ways, or one of the better ways anyway. But I think, again, there's more to explore about cases when this happens, and how do we make it happen in a decent way, in a humane way, but nonetheless that it gets rid of the disruptive person or whatever and allows everyone else to carry on. There's two more to go. The connector role, about introducing people to each other. So we had 3 levels of connection in the book. Level 1, you as the host leader connect with people directly. I've been going around saying hello to some of the people I don't know this morning, and I'll do that, I hope, as the meeting goes on. Then there's introducing people to each other. It's the second level. Connecting people with each other, and that is a very strong host impetus. And it's not a hero impetus. It's more of a servant impetus. It's a stepping back. So hero leaders hate people communicating without going through the hero. So Whereas hosts, we want people to communicate directly because they can get on with it, they can do interesting things, we don't have to be burdened down with it, and so on. And then finally, connecting with wise interconnectedness. You can say in a way that everything is connected and there are all sorts of complex knock-on effects going on in the world. And it's good to be alert to that and aware of how that happens in a complex world. So the connector role, I think it's a surprisingly powerful way of getting things done and get things happening. Introducing people to each other. Saying, you two are interested in this, why don't you talk about it? And they can talk about it. Not, of course, not every introduction you make will flower, but some of them will. Very strong thing to do. So here's something I've got involved with over the last few months. The Edinburgh Minute. So the Edinburgh Minute is a new thing. It's about a year old now. It's an email that comes out at 7 a.m. every morning with the day's news. And the guy who does it gets up at 5 a.m. and scans all the news websites from the city and assembles this email newsletter. What's happening, what's going on at the moment, what are people talking about, always with links to click through to other, to the source of the thing. And he's got now more than 10,000 free subscribers to this. And it's a fantastic thing, and it takes about 3 minutes to read, and you get all the city's news in one place. Now, how is that a connector role? Well, here's how, several ways. First of all, he is, the guy who runs it, Michael McKergow, he is a news aggregator, not a journalist. So he doesn't create any news. All he does is connect his readers with the sources, the original sources of the news, which might be articles in local papers, they might be things on the local council website, they might be events happening that you can find out more about it here. So every piece he puts up has a link, so the readers can connect with it. And he also has a community notice board where people like me can send in things that are happening that he might be able to share with his readers. And I think it's a fantastic initiative. And I asked the people who run the local newspaper, what do you think of it? Don't you hate him because he's like putting your stories out? And they said, no, we love him. We love him because we get readers, because he's putting the news out there. So he's connecting people and the news sources, and people with things to say, all together in this very, very nice, easy, free fashion. The maths of connection. I did a little bit about this. This is fascinating when people don't know how strong the maths of connection are. So let's imagine, here's you in the middle of a network of, say, 20 people. Let's imagine you know 20 people. Do you know 20 people? Yes, I'm sure you do. Now, if you know 20 people, how many connections are there between those 20 people? Well, some of you can do the maths, and you do 20 squared, and then you divide it by 2 because me connecting with Christina is the same as Christina connecting with me, so we have half the number. The number is 200. 200 connections between all your connections. Now, but those people all have networks of 20 people themselves. And if we look at how many sort of second level connections there are, that might be 4,000 people. Now, in real life, of course, some of those will be the same, and the people will know each other from different directions. But a network of 4,000 people, that's quite a lot, isn't it? That you have potentially there to use. But actually 20 people is a real underestimate, isn't it? Because, so let's see what happens to the same math if you do it with a network of 150, which is much more like our level of actual kind of connections to people we kind of know reasonably well. If you start with a network of 150, then between that 150 people there are over 11,000 connections, different connections. And if you look at their network as well, you end up with 1.6 million connections, all from the people you know already. And we don't utilise this nearly enough. And one of the reasons we don't utilise it really, I find myself not utilising it, is we think in silos. I find myself thinking in silos. So I have friends who are musicians, and a lot of them know each other, but I have other friends who are coaches, and a lot of them know each other. But do I do any connecting between the musicians and the coaches? Honestly, not enough. And I have lots of groups of friends who are I treat in isolation, and I don't try and connect between. And I think it would be more interesting if I did that. And I'd be tapping into this kind of maths if I did that. And finally, the co-participator role, the joining in with it as well as leading it. I think it's still very distinctive to host leadership. You don't read about it in many other places. And it's something I struggle with, I'll be honest with you. I find if I'm organising, let's say, Sunday Assembly, one of our processes is to have small group discussions about what the speaker has said this morning. And I sometimes feel that I've organised it, I've played in the band, I've introduced the speaker. Have I really got to go and sit with other people and talk about it as well? But actually, yes, I do. And actually, in the end, I feel better for it. But I noticed that there's this kind of internal little bit of resistance in me. So do I have to do that? But it's better if I do. I've learned that. People don't do it, I think, because they worry that the other people will think they're being put under the microscope, under the spotlight. Oh, the boss is coming, we better all behave. Whereas if they get used to the fact that you're around and you show up and you join in occasionally, I think that problem goes away. And I think this is one of the key topics that we might think about here, is how do we do more co-participating and make that, reduce those barriers for ourselves and make that more of a natural thing. And also, the leader who's joining in with people also gets to hear from them. He gets to hear what their key things are, which is important. So, that went on a bit longer than I was hoping. Never mind. Let us, everybody, gather into groups of about four or five, preferably with people you don't know very well. And my question is, so based on your knowledge of host leadership so far, which might be decades or it might be just started an hour ago, what strikes you from what I've said here about what I've learned? What do you think you've learned? And is there anything else is there anything that's missing from this